Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Shirley Hoogstra. Women in Juarez, Mexico are being murdered by the hundreds, and their killers are not being prosecuted by authorities. A visual artist learned about this femicide and had a strong reaction. Hear and see what she created to give these silenced women a voice. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Mandy Cano Villalobos, visual artist and professor in the Calvin College Art Department. Today we're discussing her installation called Voces, which commemorates the extraordinary number of women murdered in Chihuahua, Mexico. Welcome, Mandy.
Thank you.
Much of your early artwork focused on family and personal stories. How did you get started with that?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with my personal experiences being raised in a military family. So we moved around quite a bit. And then this idea of home becomes something that is longed for but not necessarily grasped. So a lot of my work, my earlier work, focused upon that idea of personal memory and of a longing for home. So for example, in one project, the Elco farm project, I worked alongside a family in rural Virginia, and together we traced their family heritage, their lineage, and how that related to this idea of land and of property and of both history as location and history as familial narrative and relationships.
So you were actually working with subjects and their particular stories. So these weren't just objects that didn't belong to particular people. The objects that you put into your art had their own owners.
Yes, yeah, definitely. In fact, I literally did work alongside the family using photographs and recreating those photographs, but also using actual farm materials and personal possessions and putting those, not only arranging an installation on the farm, but then putting those in the gallery.
The Voces project, how did you get connected to the stories of the women who were murdered in Juarez?
I lived in El Paso for a while, and so we would go across the border and spend some time, some family time there, just going out to eat or walking.
So it was a lovely place to be.
Exactly. And then years later, I was actually attending a conference, and this was one of the subjects that was not necessarily addressed, but brought up through one of the lectures. And so I was very curious about it. It was a bit jarring to hear this negative connection, this massively negative connection, yes, not only with Juarez, but also with women, because the femicides are obviously gender-specific killings. So I went home that night and I began to do a lot of research, just reading about them through newspapers, through things I could find online. And so the more I became aware of what was going on, the more I felt the need to address that somehow.
So it just pulled at you like something should be said or talked about or made more aware. People should be more aware of this problem. Yes,
definitely. Although I will have to admit that an art project didn't suddenly spring to mind, right, but I definitely felt unsettled.
We're going to take a look at a documentary now that talks about this particular problem, and we're going to see what has happened to this city that you remembered and now has a very different identification. So let's watch that.
Ciudad Juárez está situada al norte del estado de Chihuahua, en México. Es la frontera con El Paso, Texas, en los Estados Unidos. Los datos más recientes del Instituto Municipal de Investigación y Planeación hablan de una población de 1.300.000 habitantes que se asientan hoy en 22.784 hectáreas. Ciudad Juárez es la frontera más grande de México y la ciudad más...
Pues de aquí se fue a trabajar y se llegó al trabajo.
¿Dónde trabajaba?
Trabajaba aquí en una maquila. Está cerquita, pero pues se fue a las 6 de la mañana y ya no llegó al trabajo.
Su hija.
Pues iba a buscar trabajo a una maquila y por allá la agarró un individuo y la mató. A los 3 días me salió en la tele que la habían encontrado. Con su pelo largo. Y era muy buena hija, muy alegre. Ya vine, mamá me decía, vine, hecho. Está bien, hija, pásale. Pero era muy buena hija.
En Ciudad Juárez, las mujeres son asesinadas y poco se hace al respecto. Aquí, ser mujer y ser pobre es casi como ser invisible, sobre todo para la justicia y las autoridades mexicanas.
Y cuando uno analiza, sobre todo la escena del crimen, se da cuenta de que es algo muy organizado. O sea, no estamos hablando de un homicida, el típico homicida serial genérico, sino que estamos hablando de un grupo organizado. Implica, es obvio cuando dices, por ejemplo, el caso del Campo Algonero, el caso de Alejandra García Andrade, que existe un nivel de organización elevado detrás de estos homicidios. Y otros más, ¿verdad? Que se requiere recursos, se requiere más de una persona, desde la forma en que son secuestradas, desde la forma en que son asesinadas, de la forma en que son los cuerpos depositados en ciertas áreas, implica, es difícil que sea una sola persona, no son estos dos choferes que fueron acusados y que ni siquiera tienen automóvil propio, que viven día a día, que viven en una casa de 2 cuartos, o sea, aquí...
Hubo mucha brutalidad y es que son varios los asesinos que están por detrás de las muertes sistemáticas. Un grupo de hombres poderosos que han asesinado impunemente, narcotraficantes de bajo nivel que han asesinado y que nada se les ha hecho, 2 pandillas extremadamente peligrosas que han asesinado como una manera de iniciar a sus nuevos miembros.
5 cuerpos.
5 cuerpos.
3 cuerpos el día 5 y 5 al día siguiente.
¿Y aquellas de allá?
Corresponden a lo mismo. Lo que pasa es que quisimos concentrar aquí los 8, las 8 cruces para no estar, que no estuvieran
esas son del
dispersas. Son de lo mismo. Sí, son las únicas víctimas que se han encontrado.
¿Por qué la policía no se dio cuenta si levantaron de aquí 3 cuerpos y después como otros 5 al otro día?
Es muy complicado, pero yo te respondería con una pregunta. ¿Quiénes podrían venir a tirar cuerpos aquí sin levantar sospechas de que están tirando cuerpos, si no es la policía en sus vehículos oficiales?
El delito es ser pobre, ser mujer joven entre 13 años y 30 años que trabajan fundamentalmente en la maquila, ¿no? ¿Qué hace esa industria maquiladora, no? Enriquecerse. ¿Y qué hace por sus muertas? ¿Quién mueve un dedo por eso?
Rebeca. ¿Cómo era su mamá?
Alta, morenita. Ella siempre se peinaba con un short.
¿Con un?
Solito por primera vez y dije yo, pues, ¿qué será? Y lo leí y decía, si usted sigue quejándose, diciendo algo de nosotros, sigue usted y sigue la niña. Sí, pero dice ella me dice cuando me ve llorando, dice, ma, abuelita, no llore, al cabo mi mamá está ya con Diosito. Y usted ya no sufra, ya no llora. Al cabo un día ellos van a pagar lo que hicieron con mi mamá. Ella dice, la niña, ya no llore, ya no le llore a mi mamá. Pero pues imagínense, una hija, un hijo duele mucho. Pero ella era la que me mantenía, ella era la que les traía a los niños su comida, su ropa, sus zapatos y todo.
Era el sostén.
Era el sostén
económico.
Sí.
Ya han sido rotas, como esta.
¿Por qué han sido rotas, no sabes?
Estas son porque hay una campaña ahora en contra de todas estas muestras que quieren negar absolutamente todo y quieren por parte del gobierno y de los medios de comunicación y quieren retirar todo esto y aquí y en todos los demás lugares y negar absolutamente todo, que es un mito y que esto no existe, que estas muertes no existen.
So this project about femicide, where women are killed because they're women, became of interest to you, and you have been able to actually give voice to the women who have been silenced. How did you start doing that?
Well, part of that is me looking into these individual lives. So there is information provided on the internet about individual women, but I wanted to know more about not just their death, but their lives. And so through various websites.
And they have pictures.
This is true, yes. And so, I mean, there are websites that are dedicated to commemorating these women, which I think is wonderful. But I also realize that there's a disconnect there. There's not a person-to-person relationship going on. It's, you know, it's very sterile. It's me, my computer, the internet. But being able to read about these women's lives, I think, was important and necessary, at least as a first step. And then after that, being able to connect with Maricela Ortiz, who is the co-founder for Nuestras Hijas que Regresó a Casa.
What is that in English?
May Our Daughters Return Home.
Okay.
So basically the co-founders are Maricela Ortiz and Norma Andrade. Norma Andrade is the mother of one of the victims, and Maricela Ortiz was the professor of this particular victim. So together they got together in order to not only provide support for other family members whose daughters, wives, what have you, have been murdered, but also to work alongside those Mexican authorities to make sure that they are carrying out investigations swiftly, accurately.
So there is a sense that the government, at least the police, may be involved in some of the cover-up, or they may know who's doing it, and there are a variety of reasons why these murders are not investigated promptly.
Correct.
And what did you find? What did this organization share with you about that?
About
the way why they have to come alongside to make these investigations go swiftly.
Because I think that due to the connections between the authorities and some of these murders, that there needs to be an external source that basically is holding the authorities accountable for what they are or are not doing. And that's part of what this particular organization is interested in.
What are the theories for why these women die?
So many.
And they're gruesome, aren't they?
Oh yes, yeah, definitely. It's disgusting. A lot of these women are, in the past, have been much more affiliated with the maquiladores, which are the factories owned by U.S. companies
that operate in Juarez.
That operate in Juarez, right? And so a lot of these women would be sequestered to or from work, and sometimes their bodies would be found, sometimes not. And so the question then becomes, why aren't these factory owners caring for their workers? Why aren't they providing protection for their workers? A lot of the connections also have to do with murder, drug trafficking, human trafficking, or perhaps even rituals in order to enter a cartel, or perhaps even rituals in order to have a police officer come alongside working with a cartel, a drug cartel. So
they kill women for initiation?
Correct. In order to basically prove that they would be able to carry out the work that needs to be carried out to enforce power held by, say, a drug cartel or perhaps even the authorities.
So it's a loyalty.
Yes,
so, yeah. A loyalty and a proving.
To prove your authority.
To prove your authority.
Right. Loyalty and authority, yeah.
Yeah, but what it says also, which is what your exhibition does so well, is it how throwaway women are seen.
Right, yes.
In Juarez, right?
They're secondary citizens.
Right.
They're not even close to being equal with men.
No, it is so disposable, right? That you could just get rid of women as a part of an initiation right, or a loyalty right, or a job requirement. So when I saw the exhibit, I saw the personalized power of when you put their names on the shirts. All of a sudden, like you said, the flat dimension of just reading it on the internet became alive, and their lives became alive. Describe the shrines that you make.
Well, they're very much related to the Day of the Dead altars. So during the tradition of Day of the Dead, one will create an altar providing things like drinks or personal possessions or crackers, what have you, in order to...
All things that the person would have loved or
right,
touched even?
Exactly, yes. And so I specifically want to reference that tradition. And of course, I don't know these women personally, but I do want to make the viewer very much aware that these are women with lives, with things that they like, things that they did. Things that they held, things that are personal to them. And so by providing things like teddy bears, crackers, shoes, candy, little figurines, I'm trying to pinpoint their personal narratives in order that the viewer may find empathy with these individual victims, these individual people, persons, women.
Yes, and that's what came to light. So when you see things, particularly the shoes, and the fact that they're slightly worn, that means that they spent time walking, and then you see pictures of family members or little pieces of jewelry or the stuffed animals, things that meant all of a sudden it brought them into 3 dimensions. And I thought these lives had meaning, and they had families, and they were important to people, and they couldn't just be snuffed out.
Correct,
right?
yes.
And then forgotten.
Right.
And that's what your art does. It makes a person who's experiencing your exhibition all of a sudden care about these women. So tell us about the shirts that you've done.
Well, I actually remember coming across them, across the white shirts on July 4th. Salvation Army was having a huge sale, and I walked inside the doors looking for various things I might be able to use for art projects, and saw all of these white shirts arranged in white, all in front of me, stack after stack. And so I immediately thought of these women, which sounds ironic, you know, going into Salvation Army and then suddenly finding all of these white shirts. But it occurred to me, it was that point of connection that I saw these women, and I thought that I would use these white shirts to symbolize their body, their absence, their presence at the same time. And so I thought that I would use the white in order to reference things like death, things like purity, perhaps even resurrection or otherworldliness. And then I'm using thread, particularly pink thread, which references cochineal pink, which is the sort of traditional Mexican pink, and which many of the crosses that are painted or erected throughout Juarez in order to commemorate. Right, because we saw that in the video. Correct, yes. So I'm using that particular pink in order to sew their names into the shirts. And it's also a faded pink, in that the particular pink that I'm using with the thread is something that is faded to then reference that idea of a cross being outside in the desert sun and being faded. So white shirts and pink thread, and then the time taken to sew each name is something that I think does give us this sort of silent space to provide for homage, to provide for remembrance, whether we know these people or not. It's a time to honor them.
As you started then to stitch these names, and as you did it personally, what would that do for you emotionally as you stitched these names at first?
I think that it becomes wearing and emotionally exhausting at times, but then also, and I will be honest, that after you do so many, it becomes this sort of fight to not be apathetic, not to be bored, simply because there are so many names, so many women. And after so many, you do become numb. And so trying to
desensitization.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Struggling to maintain a desire to care, a desire to...
A dignity, actually, for the people who died, right?
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
But that actually happens in society, the crushing number.
Right.
It almost feels hopeless and overwhelming. So you can almost see, even in the making of the shirts with the names, how maybe this is how the people of Juarez feel. It's just overwhelming. I can't even think about it anymore.
To even fight against it is not necessarily a question of energy, of spontaneous energy, but rather perseverance.
This feels to me like you are being an activist for the women who've been murdered in a different sort of way. You have this language, this voice. Do you see yourself as an activist on this?
No, definitely not. And part of the reason I say that is I think of the many mothers who walk the streets, or there's also a group, the Women in Black, who dress in black and basically carry on a parade-like march throughout the cities, throughout the streets, to raise awareness of femicide and to mourn. And to also basically protest for or against impunity. I don't see myself as an activist in that vein, but I do very much see a sense of protest in my work through the struggle to remember these women.
I think that it's a way, the language that you use of art versus maybe a march, it also is effective, and it actually spreads the message to places that might never actually pick up a newspaper or see a wanted poster or the ads for the arrest of individuals. So in many ways, to me, it feels like there is this calling out for justice in your exhibition.
Yes, and I think that it's important also that those people to whom I'm speaking, my audience, is aware of this and does not merely look at this as an art exhibit, which it is, and which I am
Definitely.
operating at,
Definitely.
within that language,
right.
But also that there would be some sort of change not only with themselves, with how they view this particular situation, as well as their role as U.S. citizens, as consumers of various companies
right.
that own these factories. But also that perhaps not only just change within themselves, but a desire to change the circumstances.
Well, see, I was visually educated by your installation, so and it was multi-layered. So I did think now about NAFTA and the factories in Juarez, and I did think about how you could overlook the violence of women, and I did think these people had families, and it did bring out empathy. So there was this multiple layers, and it was intriguing because of the shirts on the crosses. It had a spiritual connection. So what would God demand of us? What is, to do justice for a neighbor who I had no idea about, but now I know. So what is my responsibility? Those are all the questions that I had with your installation. It was so multi-layered. It educated in the same way as it filled a room.
Well, but I think it's also important because I'm thinking about Arlington Cemetery. It's a cemetery that I used to have to drive past every day, actually. And so that the arrangement of shirts very much reference that sort of continuous order. And then this understanding of graveyard, of silence. It's that I am interested in those questions. I want people to ask those questions, but I think it is very important that they step outside of the busyness of their schedule and not just ask those questions, but truly reflect upon things and in silence be transformed. Because I think if you continue in the busyness of the everyday, that transformation is not as possible than if you are to stop and sit and reflect and almost shun that overwhelming busyness.
Right. Because it is a topic that you just can't brush by, but you have to think about more. You actually create sewing circles of women who get to think about the women who have died. How did you create sewing circles?
Well, actually, at the very beginning, I had a lot of students working with me. So it wasn't just women, it was male students as well. And it was wonderful because I saw them start to take not only an interest, but start to invest themselves in the work and take a responsibility for the work and for this particular situation. And so I understood the value of working in community very quickly. I also received support from the Calvin Center for Christian Scholarship, and they helped to then fund a sewing circle that included Mexican immigrant women from the area of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so through working with Pailalin, which is another community program that is geared towards family empowerment, and it has a lot of outreach to Latin American families. Through Pailalin, I was able to then coordinate with the director there to start these sewing circles with these women. And so together it was much more about life. Yes, we reflected upon death, but they shared their stories with me. They shared a lot of advice with me. I was pregnant when I first started working with them, and so I learned a lot about birth, ironically, through working on this project, about death.
Yes.
So, and I also learned quite a bit about Mexico in a way that I was not aware of, or a way that I had not experienced through their conversation, through their love for their country.
So by having Mexican women sew the names, it actually expanded in almost a fully orbed way, life, death, the beauty and the horror of what life is like. And this is what your art does for us.
Thank you.
My guest today has been Mandy Cano Villalobos, visual artist and professor in the Calvin College Art Department. I'm Shirley Hoogstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.